January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, the Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy stood on the runway, the sun burning over the broken airfield. Before him sat a complete Japanese bomber, a Mitsubishi G4M. The Allies called it the Betty. Its silver skin gleamed in the tropical heat. It looked almost new. The long, narrow fuselage rested on the tarmac like a metal cigar. Its engines still smelled of fuel. There were no bullet holes, no fire damage, no signs of crash or capture. It was simply abandoned, left behind as if its crew had vanished into the jungle. McCoy raised his camera with trembling hands. He had seen wrecks before, dozens of Japanese planes torn apart across the Pacific, but never one like this, whole, untouched, perfect. When he opened the inspection panels beneath the wings, he froze. Inside were the fuel tanks, thousands of liters of gasoline. No armor, no self-sealing layer, no fire protection at all, just thin aluminum skin. Metal holding explosive fuel. It made no sense. No Air Force in the world would build a bomber this way. Yet here it was. Japan's main long-range bomber. The plane that had helped conquer half of Asia. McCoy didn't know it yet. But what he found that day would rewrite how the Allies understood Japanese aircraft design. It would show a philosophy so extreme, so different, that it shocked engineers from every Allied nation. It was a machine built for distance, not survival. 4 years earlier. December 8th, 1941. The morning after Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M bombers and 26 G3M bombers lifted off from Formosa. Their target, Clark Field, the same base where McCoy now stood. At 12:35 in the afternoon, the bombers appeared over the Philippines. They flew at 20,000 feet, too high for American guns to reach. 7 bombers from the first wave dropped more than 600 bombs across the airfield. Moments later, 0 fighters swept in low. Their guns shredded the aircraft that had survived the first strike. 17 flying fortresses sat on the ground. 12 were destroyed in minutes, almost. Every P-40 Warhawk burned where it stood. In less than 1 hour, American air power in the Philippines ceased to exist. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few survivors, wrote later, "What struck me was how calm they were. They came in perfect formation, high, silent, untouchable. Then, the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We never had a chance. Those same bombers, the Bettys, flew back to Formosa, untouched. They had struck from more than 460 miles away. Range no American aircraft could match. The message was clear. Japan now ruled the skies of the Pacific. 2 days later, December 10th, 26 Betty bombers took part in one of the most shocking attacks in naval history. Their targets, the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. Together, they formed the core of Britain's Force Z. The Japanese bombers approached in perfect waves. They carried torpedoes built for shallow water, Type 91 weapons designed to run low and true. At 12:20 in the afternoon, the first attack began. The Prince of Wales, pride of the Royal Navy, took 6 torpedo hits. Explosions ripped open her hull. Flooding spread fast. Minutes later, Repulse was struck 4 times while turning hard to avoid the next wave. Its guns shot down several attackers, but the sea swallowed it soon after. In less than 2 hours, both ships were gone. More than 800 British sailors died. It was the first time in history that major warships, fully at sea and defending themselves, had been sunk entirely by aircraft. And it was the Betty that made it possible. The bomber that looked fragile on the ground had just destroyed the illusion of naval invincibility. Across early 1942, the Betty appeared everywhere: the Philippines, Malaya, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands. It hit targets beyond the reach of Allied fighters. Its range allowed Japan to strike where no one thought possible. At Darwin, Australia, at Port Moresby, at Rabaul, the Betty's long wings carried it across oceans and mountain ranges. For 6 months, it ruled the skies unchallenged, but that power came with a secret cost, one that every Japanese crew would soon pay. By the middle of 1942, The war in the Pacific began to change. American fighter strength was growing. The old Wildcats were replaced by faster, deadlier Hellcats and Corsairs. New tactics and radar systems gave Allied pilots the upper hand. And suddenly, the Betty's greatest strength, its range and speed, became meaningless. The first disaster struck on August 8, 1942. 23. Betty bombers left Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. They never made it back. American fighters intercepted them over Savo Island. In the brief, violent battle that followed, 18 of the 23 bombers were shot down. 120 Japanese aviators died in flames. For the first time, the myth of the untouchable Betty was gone. The aircraft that had once terrified Allied forces was now burning in the sky. Pilots gave it cruel nicknames. The Flying Cigar, the One-Shot. Lighter, the Flying Zippo, because every time a bullet touched its wings or fuselage, the plane exploded. By October 1942, the Betty's reputation had completely changed. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn, leader of the famed VF-17 Jolly Rogers, described it simply, "Hit them anywhere, and they blow up. We hunted them. They were easy meat." But the real reason behind those losses remained a mystery until the Allies captured Japanese airfields intact. In November 1942, Australian forces overran the Buna airfield in Papua New Guinea. There, among the wrecks, they found several Betty bombers almost whole. When engineers opened the wing panels, they saw it clearly. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no protection of any kind. This was not an accident or field repair. This was designed. The Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit sent reports to every command in the Pacific. Their analysis confirmed what pilots had been seeing for months. American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress had heavy armor and self-sealing tanks that swelled shut when hit. The B-24 Liberator, even the lighter twin-engine Mitchells, carried layers of rubber and steel to prevent fires. But the Japanese Betty, Japan's main bomber, had nothing. No wonder it exploded. Every bullet that pierced the thin aluminum skin went straight into the fuel. Every tracer turned the wings into torches. And yet, the design was no mistake. It was intentional. Japanese engineers had sacrificed protection for performance. By removing all safety systems, they saved more than 500 kilograms of weight, enough to carry extra fuel. That fuel gave the Betty its legendary range of over 6,000 kilometers. It could strike across half an ocean, but only if it survived long enough to come back. When Major McCoy's team examined the captured Betty at Clark Field in 1945, they spent 3 weeks taking it apart. Every measurement confirmed the same truth. Empty weight, about 6,700 kilograms. Fuel capacity, 4,780 liters, spread across 8 tanks, 4 in each wing. No armor, no rubber lining, no fire. Suppression, just thin metal and hope. The unprotected fuel tank sat directly where the wings met the fuselage, the most likely place to be hit in. Combat engineers called it a critical failure point. A single burst of gunfire could turn the plane into a fireball. But this wasn't carelessness, it was math. The origins of that decision went back to 1937. That year, the Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a new long-range bomber. It had to fly nearly 5,000 kilometers, carry 800 kilograms of bombs or a torpedo, and reach almost 400 kilometers per hour. No other nation in the world had a bomber with that kind of range. Even America's B-17 was far behind in its early models. To meet those demands, Japan's engineers would have to do the impossible. The man responsible was Kiro Honjo, chief designer at Mitsubishi. He had studied aircraft design in Germany at Junkers, learning European methods of lightweight metal construction. When he returned to Japan, he knew that the Navy's request could only be met through extreme sacrifice. Every kilogram mattered. Fuel weighed almost 1 kilogram per liter. The aircraft needed thousands of liters to reach its target, and return armor and safety systems would make that impossible. So Honjo made the choice that would define the Betty forever. Protection would be sacrificed for range. The result was an aircraft that looked elegant, fast, and efficient, but one that turned into a torch under enemy fire. In October 1939, the first prototype took flight. It exceeded every performance. Goal, speed, range, Payload, all perfect. The Navy was thrilled. They ordered the new plane into production as the Type 1 attack bomber. In April 1941, the first squadrons received their Bettys. By December, more than 180 were ready, just in time for the opening. Strikes of the Pacific War, the bomber that could reach farther than any other aircraft in the world had, arrived. And in the first months of war it seemed unstoppable. When the Betty entered combat in early 1942, it seemed unstoppable. It struck from distances that no Allied aircraft could match, from Formosa to the Philippines, from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, across oceans and mountains. The Betty carried Japan's power wherever it was needed. For the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the bomber's range gave Japan total freedom of movement. It could attack from bases that the Allies could not even reach. Every major Japanese victory in that period, from the fall of Singapore to the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, had the shadow of a Betty overhead, but success hid the truth. That power depended on one fragile assumption, that the enemy would never catch up. By the summer of 1942, America's factories were roaring. New fighters rolled off assembly lines each week. Radar networks extended across the Pacific, and trained pilots, no longer outnumbered, began hunting the Betty in the skies it once ruled. At first, the Japanese command refused to believe the reports. They called the losses temporary. They blamed weather, luck, or pilot error. But by the time of the Guadalcanal campaign, the numbers were impossible to ignore. From August to October, more than 100 Betty bombers were lost. 700 crewmen died. Entire squadrons were wiped out in a single mission. The same qualities that had once made the Betty superior, speed, range, and lightweight, now made it the easiest target in the sky. Japanese engineers tried to fight back with small changes. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, they added thin rubber sheets beneath the wings, 30 millimeters thick, barely enough to slow a leak. It wasn't real armor. It wasn't a self-sealing tank. It was just a desperate attempt to buy time. The result? Almost no difference. The rubber slowed small leaks, but couldn't stop fire. Tracer rounds still turned the wings into flames. Crews still died in seconds. By 1944, Japan introduced a new model, the G4M Model 3. This version finally had true self-sealing tanks. But to make room for them, engineers had to remove more than 2,000 liters of fuel. The range dropped from 6,000 kilometers to less than 4,000. The Betty had lost the one thing it was built for. Only about 60 of these improved bombers were ever made. They came too late. By then, the skies over the Pacific belonged entirely to the Allies. In April 1943, the Betty played another role, one that sealed its place in history. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander who had planned Pearl Harbor, was flying aboard a Betty bomber. American codebreakers intercepted his travel schedule. They knew exactly where and when his plane would be. 18 P-38. Lightnings took off from Guadalcanal. They flew 400 miles at wave top height to avoid radar. At 9:34 in the morning, they reached the intercept point. 2 Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, appeared ahead. The American pilots split their formation. Lieutenant Rex Barber aimed for the lead bomber. Yamamoto's plane fired a burst into the left wing. The bullets hit the fuel tanks. The Betty exploded in mid-air. The admiral of the Japanese fleet was dead before the wreckage hit the jungle below. The second bomber went down minutes later. None survived. That mission showed everything about the Betty, its speed, its reach, and its fatal flaw. It could travel across oceans, but it could not survive a single burst of gunfire. The same design that had given Japan its early victories had now claimed the life of its greatest commander. The engineers had built exactly what they were told to build. And that was the tragedy. When Japan's engineers designed the Betty, they believed they were creating the perfect weapon for a Pacific empire. They needed range, they needed speed, and they needed a bomber that could strike across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The design worked, at first. The Betty could reach targets the Allies thought were safe. It could take off from distant islands and hit ships, ports, and bases that no other bomber could touch. In the early months of the war, Its reach was unmatched, but range had come at a terrible price. The crew sat inside a thin shell of metal and fuel. The slightest hit from a bullet or cannon shell turned the plane into fire. Pilots joked bitterly that flying the Betty meant flying a torch. By the end of 1943, the loss rate was so high that even Japanese commanders began to question the design. But there was no time to change it. Japan's industry could not stop production. They needed bombers more than ever, even if each one was a death sentence. The situation grew desperate. American radar could now track Betty formations long before they arrived. Fighter groups intercepted them miles from their targets. Bombing missions turned into massacres. Still, the bombers kept flying. They attacked supply lines, airfields, and naval fleets. Many carried torpedoes meant for American ships. Others carried suicide weapons. The Oka, a rocket-powered bomb piloted by a single man. On March 21st, 1945, 18 Betty bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each with an Oka slung beneath its belly. Their goal was to reach the American fleet off Okinawa, but they never made it. Radar spotted them 100 miles out. Hellcats from the USS Hornet climbed to meet them. The Bettys were heavy, slow, and unable to maneuver. One by one they exploded in midair. Not a single bomber reached release range. Not one Oka was launched. 137 bomber crewmen and 15 Oka pilots died in that attack. The mission revealed the final truth about the Betty. The aircraft that had once symbolized Japan's power now symbolized its helplessness. It could no longer fight. It could only burn. 4 months later, the war was over. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. On August 19th, 2 white-painted Betty bombers took off from Atsugi Airfield. They bore green crosses instead of red suns. Their mission was not war, it was peace. Inside were Japan's surrender delegates. The call signs were Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, named after the place where American forces had fallen 3 years earlier. The planes flew to Iwo Jima, where the delegates transferred to an American transport. Escorted by American fighters, the White Bettys crossed the same skies that had once burned with war. The aircraft that had opened the conflict at Clark Field in 1940, one now carried Japan's surrender. In 1945, the circle was complete. The Betty had begun the war as a weapon of terror and ended it as a symbol of defeat. It showed the world what happens when performance is valued above survival. It proved that range means nothing when the aircraft cannot live to finish the mission. Japan had built a bomber that could reach anywhere, except home. By the end of the war, only a few Betty bombers were still flying. Most had been destroyed in combat or burned on the ground. Factories that once produced 100 planes a month now stood in ruins. Japan's skies, once filled with the hum of Mitsubishi engines, were silent. In total, around 2,400 Betty bombers had been built. Some records say slightly more, others slightly less. But what mattered was not the number built. It was the number lost. Almost every one of them was destroyed. Very few ever returned home from their missions. The losses told the story better than any statistic. Each destroyed bomber meant 7 men gone, 7 families left behind, 7 lives consumed by fire. Pilots knew the risks. They called the Betty beautiful but deadly, an aircraft that demanded their lives in exchange for its range. One former petty officer described it simply. The Betty was magnificent, but it asked us to die for its beauty. We flew because we were ordered to fly. We died because that was what the plane was made to do. The contrast with American bombers could not have been greater. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried heavy armor, plates to protect its pilots. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. The glass around the bombardier's seat was bullet-resistant. The fuselage was divided into sections so that fire could not spread easily. Even smaller American bombers like the B-25 Mitchell had similar protection. Their empty weight was nearly 2,000 kilograms more than the Betty's, all because of armor and safety systems. The result was clear. American crews survived far more often. Studies done during the war proved body armor reduced chest wound. Deaths from 36% to 8%. Self-sealing. Tanks cut fire-related casualties by more than half. Planes with these protections returned to base again and again. For Japan, such protection was impossible. Their factories lacked the resources to build heavier planes. Their strategy demanded range, not armor. They believed the war would end quickly, before the Allies could recover. They were wrong. By 1943, the tide had turned. American fighters filled the skies. Radar networks warned of incoming raids. Every Betty mission became an act of sacrifice. The bomber that had once represented Japan's reach now represented its ruin. Major McCoy's discovery at Clark Field in 1945 confirmed everything. The unprotected fuel tanks he found were not a mistake or shortcut. They were the deliberate result of a design philosophy that valued range over survival. The engineers had made their choice years earlier. They believed that speed and distance would win the war. They believed that the enemy would never catch up. They believed that surprise would be enough to keep their crews alive. Every one of those beliefs turned out to be wrong. The Betty became a flying lesson in the cost of those assumptions. It showed that performance without protection is just another form of suicide. A bomber can fly 6,000 kilometers, but that means nothing if it cannot survive the final 100. It can carry a ton of bombs, but it means nothing if the crew never comes home. And it can win battles, but lose the war. The Betty did all three. When the Allies examined the Betty in detail, they realized it was not a flawed machine. It was, in fact, brilliantly designed, for a purpose that no longer made sense. The engineers at Mitsubishi had done exactly what their Navy had demanded. They built a bomber that could fly farther than any other aircraft in the world. They simply did not build one that could survive. In 1937, those decisions made sense. Japan's empire stretched across enormous distances, from the home islands to China, to the Philippines, to the Dutch East Indies, thousands of kilometers apart. A bomber that could cross oceans without refueling gave Japan a unique advantage. No other nation had such reach. At that time, air combat was still new. Fighter aircraft had limited range. Most military leaders believed long-range bombers would fly safely above the reach of enemy fighters. They thought that speed and altitude could protect them better than armor ever could. The Betty was built on that belief. And for the first few months of the war, it worked perfectly. But once the Allies learned how to intercept them, once American, industry began to flood the skies with newer, faster planes. That belief turned into a death trap. By late 1942, American pilots knew the Betty's weaknesses by heart. They aimed for the wings or the fuel tanks. 2 or 3 bursts were enough. The sky would light up with fire. It was quick. It was certain. For Japan's airmen, there was no escape. Even parachutes often failed, because the aircraft burned too fast. Those who did survive were usually badly injured. The rest vanished into the sea or jungle, never to be found. The attrition was relentless. Every mission took trained men who could not be replaced. Japan's air arm slowly bled out, not from lack of courage, but from a design that offered none of its crews a real chance to live. By 1944, the Betty was obsolete, yet it remained in service. There were simply no alternatives. Newer bombers like the Ginga and Renzan were too few and too late. The Betty, light and fragile, continued to fly missions it could not possibly survive. When Japan turned to suicide tactics, the Betty became part of that effort too. It carried pilots and weapons built for one-way missions. The plane's own fragility made it a fitting symbol of the desperation that defined Japan's final year of war. The skies over the Pacific were filled with fire. Every engagement ended the same way. The bright flash of exploding fuel, the fall of burning wreckage, and the silence that followed. For Allied pilots, shooting down a Betty was easy, but watching it burn was not. They knew that inside each of those planes were men, disciplined, skilled, and doomed. By the time American troops reached the Philippines, the Betty had become a ghost. Its long range no longer mattered. Its speed no longer impressed. The war had passed it by. And when Major McCoy opened the inspection panels of tail number 763-12, he wasn't just examining an aircraft, he was looking at a philosophy made of metal, a belief that range could replace protection, and that courage could replace armor. He knew the truth the moment he saw those thin fuel tanks. The Betty was never meant to bring its crews home. It was meant only to reach the target. And in that goal, it succeeded. At a cost Japan could never afford. As the war drew to its end, the Betty existed mostly in memory and wreckage. The airfields that once launched proud formations of silver bombers were now graveyards of burned metal. Wings twisted, fuselages blackened, engines melted into the ground. By mid-1945, only a handful of operational Bettys remained. They could no longer strike distant targets. They were used for transport, supply, or desperate kamikaze missions. Each flight was a reminder of Japan's fading power. Then came August. The atomic bombs fell. Japan surrendered, and with that surrender came one final flight for the Betty. 2 aircraft, painted pure white with green crosses, lifted off from Atsugi Airfield. They carried Japan's peace delegation. Their call signs were Baton 1 and Baton 2. The names were chosen carefully, a symbolic echo of Japan's earlier victory at Baton, now turned into surrender. Escorted by American fighters, the white bombers flew over the same sea routes they had once used for war. The men inside wore dress uniforms instead of flight suits. They carried papers, not weapons. Their mission was to end the war they had begun. The flight from Atsugi to Iwo Jima covered about 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's range, even in its transport form. For once, the bombers flew without fear. The skies were calm. No gunfire, no explosions, only silence. When they landed, the American crews greeted them not as enemies, but as envoys. The planes that had once delivered death now carried peace. Their green crosses glowed in the tropical sun. And in that moment, the story of the Betty came full circle. The same aircraft that had destroyed American air power at Clark Field on the first day of the Pacific War now delivered Japan's surrender message. It began the conflict, and it ended it, a symbol of power transformed into a symbol of defeat. To many who saw those final Bettys, it was a haunting image. A weapon that had once embodied Japan's reach and ambition now stood for the limits of that ambition. The white paint could not hide what the plane truly was, a creation of brilliant engineering and fatal belief. The Betty had been born from logic, not madness. It was designed carefully, mathematically, to fulfill a set of requirements. Its range was unmatched, its performance impressive, but every one of its triumphs had been purchased with human lives. The Japanese Navy had wanted a bomber that could cross oceans. Mitsubishi had given them exactly that. The engineers had done their jobs perfectly. The problem was the job itself. In war, every design tells a story, not just of metal and machinery, but of the values behind it. The American approach valued protection and endurance. Bring the crew home, fight again tomorrow. The Japanese approach valued range and offense, reach the target, whatever the cost. The Betty represented that belief completely. It was the perfect weapon for a war Japan could not win, a war of reach, fought against an enemy with endless strength. Its beauty lay in its purpose, its tragedy lay in its success. After the war, the Allies studied every surviving Betty in detail. They measured every rivet, every wire, every panel. They wanted to understand how an aircraft could be both so advanced and so fragile at the same time. The reports they produced filled hundreds of pages. They described the Betty as a masterwork of efficiency, yet also a monument to vulnerability. It was light, elegant, and ingeniously built, but it had no safety margins. It had no forgiveness for error. It demanded perfection from its engineers, from its pilots, from its circumstances. American analysts quickly understood why so many Japanese airmen had died. The design philosophy behind the Betty treated the aircraft like a tool, not a life support system. Its pilots were seen as extensions of the machine. If they perished, the mission still counted as success. That idea was alien to Western engineers who designed their machines around the people inside them. In the Betty, the crew served the aircraft. In the B-17 or B-24, the aircraft served the crew. This single difference in thinking explained almost everything. It explained why Japan's early victories came fast and burned out even faster. It explained why the Allies, though slower at first, became unstoppable once their machines began surviving longer than their pilots could be replaced. The war in the Pacific wasn't just a clash of nations. It was a clash of philosophies. The numbers made that truth impossible to ignore. In 4 years of war, Mitsubishi produced about 2,400 Betty bombers. By the time Japan surrendered, Fewer than 24 were still flyable. That meant a survival rate of less than 1%. No other major aircraft of the Second World War suffered losses that high. Even the infamous German Stuka, sent against overwhelming odds, had better survival numbers. The Betty's fatal weakness, its unprotected fuel tanks, was responsible for almost every death. To Allied engineers, it became a case study in what not to do. In every Air Force school after the war, the Betty was cited as proof that speed and range mean nothing without protection. But to those who had flown it, the lesson was far more personal. They remembered not the statistics, but the faces of their crews. They remembered the smell of fuel, the roar of the engines, the flash of tracer fire, and the sudden heat when everything turned to flame. For them, the Betty wasn't just a machine. It was a fate. When Japan rebuilt after the war, its engineers carried that memory forward. Many of the same minds who had designed the Betty went on to create Japan's peaceful industries, airliners, transport planes, and commercial technology. This time, their designs protected life instead of spending it. The lesson of the Betty endured quietly. In every safe flight that followed, it reminded them that brilliance without humanity leads only to destruction, that performance without protection is hollow, and that even the most beautiful machine can become a tragedy if it forgets the value of the people inside. The Betty's aluminum wings never flew again, but its story did, carried by every engineer who understood that power means nothing if it cannot preserve the lives that use it. The story of the Betty is more than a chapter in aviation history. It is a mirror reflecting the choices nations make in war, what they value, what they fear, and what they are willing to sacrifice. In 1937, when Kiro Honjo began designing the aircraft, he faced a simple equation: range versus protection. He knew he could not have both, and he chose range. The decision made perfect sense in theory. Japan's empire stretched across thousands of miles. Its enemies were far away to strike them first and fast. The Navy needed wings that could reach across the ocean. Honjo's mathematics were flawless. His engineers were brilliant. The Betty flew farther and faster than any other bomber of its time. It met every number on the Navy's list, and in doing so, it sealed the fate of thousands of airmen who would one day fly it. Every rivet and panel told the same story: performance over protection, reach over survival. It was an airplane built for a war that could be won only if Japan struck first and won quickly. But the war did not end quickly, and the longer it went on, the more that design became a death sentence. When the Allies examined the Betty's specifications, they were astonished. Empty weight, 6,700 kilograms. Maximum takeoff, 9,500. Fuel capacity, nearly 5,000 liters. 8 separate tanks. All unprotected, every one of them a spark away from destruction. The engineers realized that the very numbers that made the Betty a masterpiece in 1939 made it a catastrophe by 1942. It was not that the Japanese had built badly. They had built too well, too purely, for a fantasy of war that no longer existed. In their laboratories, American engineers ran experiments on captured Betty wings. They fired small-caliber rounds into the fuel tanks, studying how quickly flames spread. Even a single bullet caused instant ignition. There was no delay, no warning, just a sheet of fire. One of the engineers later wrote, "It was like watching an idea burn." By the end of the war, the Betty had become a legend, but not for the reasons its creators intended. It symbolized the dangers of believing in perfection. It showed how the pursuit of ideal performance can blind a nation to reality. In a way, the Betty's long range became a metaphor for Japan's reach itself. Vast, daring, but unsustainable. The same distances that once gave Japan power became the empty spaces over which its bombers fell in flames. And when peace returned, those who survived carried that memory like a scar. The Betty had taught them that no machine, no matter how advanced, could overcome the limits of human endurance and moral cost. In the years that followed, pieces of Betty bombers lay scattered across the Pacific, in jungles, coral reefs, and forgotten runways. Some were recovered, restored, and placed in museums. Others still rest where they fell. Silent reminders of what happens when design serves ambition more than humanity. Visitors who see those wrecks today often remark on how beautiful they are. The smooth lines, the perfect symmetry, the way light glints off the faded metal, and, perhaps that is the greatest irony of all, that something so elegant could carry so much death. The Betty remains both a triumph and a warning. It proved how far human skill can go, and it proved how easily that same skill can destroy the people it serves.